So what's the real reason why Democrats keep claiming the GOP is pushing misinformation? One of the best in the business, Matt Taibbi. You see him and read him on Substack, joins us now. Matt, what's behind this big move to talk about misinformation and blaming Donald Trump specifically for it?
Well, they keep changing the definition of misinformation and disinformation, and they have another category they call malinformation. But I think the exchange you just saw between Jean-Pierre and Peter Doocy was incredibly revealing. When she identified the way he was phrasing the question as misinformation, there are actually kids' books out now about misinformation that define the asking of questions themselves as a form of misinformation. This is one of the things we found in the Twitter files, is that people who question authoritative sources, or when who don't pay attention when they surface authoritative sources, that's considered misinformative, to ignore the dictates of officials. So what she's really saying there is, you're not listening to what I'm saying. We're saying we're doing the best we can, and you're questioning that, and that's misinformation, which is crazy. Essentially, they're saying it's a lie to question the government.
It really is. And the problem is there was a lack of coordination between the people like Corey Mills with their private choppers. The Army was ready to go 4 days prior. These are legitimate questions. They waited a week to call them. When they got in, they turned the whole thing around. And those people are still suffering today. But they're focusing on Donald Trump and misinformation. And it's about the campaign, which one Joe Biden is not even in. I think he knows that well. If I can, let's talk about something different that's also causing controversy. CBS, their morning show, their host decides to take on Ta-Nehisi Coates on his anti-Israeli stance in his book. It's a fine debate. He doesn't seem upset by it. Here's a portion of it.
And it's what I struggled with throughout this book. What is it that so particularly offends you about the existence of a Jewish state that is a Jewish safe place and not any of the other states out there?
There's nothing that offends me about a Jewish state. I am offended by the idea of states built on ethnocracy, no matter where they are.
This went on for 5 minutes, and all of a sudden CBS is apologizing. They're giving special psychological treatment to the rest of the staff. He had to have a teary-eyed explanation of his series of questions. Matt, what planet are we on?
Yeah, this is the new world we live in, where when a person says something that is even a little bit off narrative, they have to, in order to stay in the good graces of mainstream media or, their social circle, they have to go through these public struggle sessions. But that's an extraordinary situation, especially given what happened with 60 Minutes earlier this week, when they put out two different versions of an interview with Vice President Harris and then did not explain it to the public. And that was a major event sort of in the history of American journalism, to edit a presidential interview during a campaign. So those two things, those two episodes show that the networks are very worried about one thing, but they're not worried about traditional journalistic ethics, right, which is deeply concerning.
I just want to show you this real quick. Gayle King was able to ask an anti-Israeli question, had no problem. Watch this, same show, different host.
Seems to be all about politics. What do you say about that? You have innocent children and Palestinians who are dying, innocent Israeli children who are dying. And no one seems to be able to say, enough, stop that.
I'm not interested in politics at all.
That his daughter is being held hostage. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't understand the idea of trying to get an answer out of a relative of a hostage in that situation. Everything is politicized now. That reminds me a little bit in a weird way of the question in the debate where they're talking about the hurricanes, and the first thing they think to talk about is global warming. It's just completely crazy.
It is, Matt. See, you see an agenda in everything, but the American people are making their own decisions. They're not being led by that. I think that's pretty clear. Matt Taibbi, thanks so much.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.